want to welcome those of you who are here in person with us at B'nai Israel in Rockville, Maryland, and to those of you numbering at least 500 who are with us on Zoom. You've joined us from all over the country. Our normal lectures have about 30 states represented, several Canadian provinces, and people scattered around the rest of the world. I also want to welcome the C-SPAN cameras covering a Haberman event for the first time. For those of you who are new to Haberman, a few things about us. For the past 40 years, we've sponsored programs chosen to provide adults with encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Before COVID changed everything, our programs were all in person, and our participants all from the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Today, our reach is much broader through Zoom. You can learn more about us by looking at our website. Easy to remember, it's habermaninstitute.org. This is our last program for 2022, but we have 3 major lectures scheduled already for January of next year. One by Dr. Jeremy England of Georgia Tech, one by Georgetown professor Ori Soltis, and one by Dr. Arya Sapoznik of Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. You can learn more about each of these on the website. Before we get to our program tonight, I have a number of people I want to thank. I want to thank Congregation B'nai Israel, a continuing partner of ours, for providing us with this wonderful space and streaming capacity. Second, our thanks to the Southern Jewish Historical Society, with whom we have worked before and will work again in the future for co-sponsoring this event. And third, to the Chappelle Manuscript Foundation for bringing Professor Mendelson here to join us. And although we're talking tonight about the Civil War and Jewish participation in the Civil War, let me suggest that tomorrow you go to www.chappelle.org and look at the many, many historical documents that they have been collecting and digitalizing. But when you do, make sure you have a lot of time, because you will be fascinated with everything having to do with this extraordinary collection started 50 years ago by Benjamin Chappelle and growing ever since. Our program tonight is a little different from the normal. We're dividing it into 2 parts. We're going to begin with an up-close look at one of the Chappelle Foundation's major projects, the roster of Jewish service in the American Civil War. And providing us with this update remotely will be Adrienne DeArmas, the director of the roster. When that part of the program is completed, we will be treated to a conversation between Professors Adam Mendelsohn and Pam Nadell on Professor Mendelson's new book, Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War. I'll introduce that part of the program in a little more detail after we hear from Ms. DeArmas. Adrienne DeArmas has been with the Chappelle Manuscript Foundation for over 10 years, and she has more than 25 years' experience in private source historical document research, database, and digital asset management. She has an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington University and a BA in Anthropology from Emory. Before I introduce her, I have one question for the audience with us. Is there anybody here today whose ancestors fought in the Civil War? There is one in the audience. Okay, and on the screen, I know there are many, many more. Questions and answers. It is possible for you to ask questions of our 2 later panelists. If you are here in the audience, you've been given a card that you can write the questions on, and they will be collected later. If you are on Zoom, you'll have to email the questions to info, at habermaninstitute.org. They will be read and collected and put on cards and added to those that come from our audience. That's it for me right now. Adrienne, DeArmas, from wherever you are on streaming in, the floor, the screen, the microphone, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Chappelle Manuscript Foundation, I want to thank all of you for attending. Everyone at the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, B'nai Israel Congregation, and the Southern Jewish Historical Society for sponsoring this event. And a special thank you to Dan Cohen and Becky Levy for making it possible for me to participate remotely. I also want to thank Thea Wieseltier for her extraordinary ability to turn ideas into strategic partnerships, whether it's finding the right publisher, in this case, NYU Press, or compelling the Jewish community to take an interest in a niche project like the roster. Thanks to Benjamin Chappelle's vision, the Chappelle roster redefines how we look at Jews in the American Civil War. Adam Mendelsohn's outstanding job of transforming the data we've been amassing into such engaging and thought-provoking prose is proof of this. My team and I are pretty passionate about our work. When anyone asks Alex what she does for a living, her reply is, "How much time do you have?" Caitlin named her daughter after Clara Barton. The Gettysburg battlefield was Vonnie's playground as a child. And while it might not be visible via video, I have Union blue highlights in my Confederate gray hair. Why do we love what we do? The surge of adrenaline when we find what we're looking for isn't nothing, but we also feel a very deep sense of responsibility. History remembers many of the soldiers and sailors we research, and descendants remember their ancestors. But for the boys and men who have no descendants or didn't leave a mark in the historical record, if we don't remember them, who will? But I've gotten ahead of myself, so let me give you some background on how we got here. Who was Simon Wolf? What do you need to know about him? And why are we reappraising his magnum opus? Briefly, Simon Wolf was a Bavarian-born immigrant who became a Washington, D.C.-based social justice warrior who advised multiple U.S. presidents on Jewish-related topics. His legacy, a book entitled The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen, was created in response to anti-Semitic rhetoric about Jewish patriotism or the lack thereof. Published in 1895, it included more than 8,000 names of soldiers and sailors who served in the American Civil War. As you can see, it was predominantly a somewhat alphabetical list of names and regiments, with the occasional details such as Victor Purley, 7th Infantry, killed at Chancellorsville. For Ben Chappelle and other collectors with an interest in both the Civil War and American Jewish history, it was an invaluable resource, but it wasn't very user-friendly. And it wasn't 100% reliable. And so the idea of what would become the Chappelle roster was born. When I first started on this project more than a decade ago, the assignment was to confirm military service for the names in Wolf's book and add any he overlooked. Scholars believe that if any of the names were not Jewish, the number was so insignificant as to not be worth our time or effort. The first seed of doubt about this assumption was planted by a Massachusetts soldier named Henry Marks, who was brought up on charges for stealing a ham for his personal use. The next clue came from an obituary for the mother of a Pennsylvania soldier named Philip Halpin. It stated that she'd, quote, lived a true Christian life, end quote, and so on and so on. As of today, our research has determined that 10% of the names from Wolf's book are definitively not Jewish, so not insignificant after all. But this isn't surprising, given that name profiling was considered a sound research methodology at that time. Nevertheless, if we were to create a solid foundation for the future study of American Jewish history, Wolf's 19th century work needed a 21st century upgrade. How do we do what we do? Carefully and collaboratively. We have two mandates: obtain proof of military service and evidence a soldier was Jewish. Service is usually pretty straightforward, but proving that someone who lived more than 150 years ago was Jewish, that's a bit trickier. Whereas not all resources are equally reliable, we look for evidence of religion in cemeteries, newspapers, archives, genealogical websites, and even military records. One of our best resources is descendants. So if you or someone you know has an ancestor who was in America circa 1860, please contact us. If they served, we want to include them in the roster. In addition to vetting the names of Wolf, we add the names he omitted. To date, we've added nearly 1,500, 88 of which were added this year, and last month we added 14, almost all of whom were sent to us by descendants. While I'm talking about numbers, allow me to address the most often asked question we receive: how many Jews served in the Civil War? The reality is the answer changes every single day. Just last week, I confirmed that M and D Barwald were Jewish brothers Morris and David, and that Morris served under the name of Barwood, and that the records for David's regiment did not survive the war. Between new additions and finding new evidence that a name from Wolf was Jewish, the Chappelle roster is constantly being updated. But more importantly, the numbers tell us nothing about these men. Remember how Wolf listed Victor Purley killed at Chancellorsville? Here's what the Chappelle roster has for Victor Purley: affidavits from his mother, a photo, more background information from his cousin, a family tree, and the register of his birth from a synagogue in Hungary, courtesy of a descendant I met on Ancestry last week. The descendant didn't know that Victor had immigrated to America and died at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and we didn't know much about his life in Hungary. So it was a very fruitful collaboration for both of us. Much more than a military roll of honor, the Chappelle roster soldier pages contain the carefully collected details of their lives and, our favorite feature, the connections between them. Whether they married a fellow soldier's sister, maintained a lifelong friendship with someone they once shared a tent with, or served with their brothers, fathers, and cousins. After a decade of being immersed in their lives, I can tell you that not every one of them left footprints in the historical record, but when they did, we found them to be brave heroes and cowardly deserters, pillars of their communities, and criminals. While some died much too young, many others were celebrated centenarians. Getting to know each and every one of them has been a privilege and a pleasure, as has being here tonight. Thank you.
Adam Mendelsohn, who will come up here in a minute, is the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies and an associate professor of history at the University of Cape Town. He's a graduate of the University of Cape Town. He's from Cape Town, and he has his PhD from Brandeis. He's the author originally of a book called Rag Race: How Jews Sowed Their Way to Success in America and the British Empire. And if I had asked the question, not how many people had relatives in the Civil War, but how many people had relatives who were in the rag trade, that would be a different number of hands. He's also co-written Jews in the Civil War, a reader, which he did with Brandeis professor Jonathan Sarna. Transnational Traditions, New Perspectives on American Jewish History with Ava Kahn. And Yearning to Breathe Free, Jews in Gilded Age America, also with Jonathan Sarna. That's very recent. He's the co-editor of the journal Jewish Historical Studies, and he previously co-edited the journal American Jewish History, and of course his newest book, Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army, is what we are here to talk about tonight. So the ultimate question is, how did a nice Jewish boy from South Africa wind up as a preeminent scholar of American Jewish history? And it shows that you never know. Many of you know Professor Pamela Nadell, who will be in conversation with Professor Mendelson. She holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at the American University here in Washington. She directs the Jewish Studies program. Her most recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from colonial times until today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year. And she has spoken to Haberman before, and I spoke on that very book. She's currently writing a book about the history of American anti-Semitism that will be published in 2025 by W.W. Norton. So I invite Professor Nadell and Professor Mendelsohn to the podium. I'm going to take away this music stand. I'm going to give a microphone to Professor Mendelsohn, Professor Nadell.
This one? Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's wonderful to be here. First of all, to be in person with a number of people. And I don't know if you actually brought a slide. So if you didn't bring a slide, here, for those of you who are watching at home, is a copy of Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army. And there aren't that many scholars who actually in one semester published 2 books. And here, and I probably need 2 hands to lift it, Adam, because it weighs about 5 pounds, is Yearning to Breathe Free, Jews in Gilded Age America, which it just came out in the fall also. So congratulations, it's been quite a semester for you. So I'm really thrilled to be here in conversation with Adam, and I think that we should really start with the question that we just heard. So how does a nice Jewish boy from Cape Town, South Africa, become a historian of the Civil War in America?
It's a good question, and it's a good question, and without necessarily a simple answer. That my path into an interest in American Jewish history really came initially from focusing on Jews in South Africa and then looking for comparisons. And the initial comparison was with Jews in the South. And that was my entry point into American Jewish history. And obviously one of the key formative experiences for Jews in the American South, never mind Jews in the United States more broadly, is the Civil War. And this is a formative moment, obviously in American society, a transformative moment for America itself, but also one where I came to understand that we knew less than we should about the experience of Jews. There is a literature, a very good literature in fact, which on Jews and the Civil War, which there's a seminal book, a wonderful book, written on the topic in the 1950s, but I discovered very little since. And so when this opportunity came to then work with the Chappelle Manuscript Foundation, about which we heard a bit earlier about what they've been up to, I seized upon it, that this is a very unusual opportunity to get to both focus on a topic which has not received sufficient attention, but also do it in a way which the incredible work of the foundation over years to create this database of Jewish soldiers in the war provided a very, very unusual access to Jewish experience at this extraordinary time in American history.
So we've heard something about the Chappelle Foundation, and it's rare to see a brand new resource like this emerge that will let us and let you revise everything, virtually everything that we knew about the Civil War from the 1950s work of Bertram Korn. So how can you tell us a little bit about how working with that shaped your research? Because I also know from my own research that you were using other sources as well, so I'd like to hear a little bit about those too.
So absolutely. So the foundation's work in compiling this roster of Jews who had fought in the war, both Union soldiers and those who fought for the Confederacy as well, is transformative in 2 ways. One way is it provides this opportunity to get an intimate knowledge of the experience of individuals. So individuals who, some were known to us before, but many of whom were not recognized, were sometimes a name on a page and often were completely unknown to historians. And the Chappelle Foundation's work is in terms of both verifying the military service of individuals, plus also verifying that these individuals were Jewish. In the process of doing this, they accumulated and collected a vast number of documents of all sorts, military service records, pension records, a whole variety of things, obituaries, etc., etc. So there both was this opportunity to dive down, to see and come to terms with, understand individuals, but also then to zoom backwards as well, to take a much broader view at the same time, and to look at this broader patterns in terms of Jewish experience in the war as well. So both this intimate view and the collective view too. And that allowed for something which is new, which is to compare Jewish experience with that of other soldiers, to get a sense of, was there anything distinctive about being a Jew in the army? And was there anything distinctive about these Jews who served as well, in terms of where they came from, their age patterns, when they enlisted, how long they enlisted for, all sorts of things of that kind. So this richness of data was an extraordinary, and only possible because of this, the work of the Chappelle Foundation. But then, as you've alluded to, what another substantial part of this book, and really reflected in the text as well, are the individual stories which come out through letters and diaries and memoirs. And there are a whole number of individuals with very different experiences of the war. Again, there are certainly those with heroic experiences of the war, those who are distinguished for one reason or another. But to bring to life at the same time the anonymous individuals, those who are otherwise lost to history, and to be able to echo their voices, to reproduce their voices through their letters, through their diaries and memoirs is again something which I sought to do with the book as well.
It's actually one of my favorite parts about the book, because you have the big picture as you've been explaining, and you can also, he's able to describe how it's different than the experiences of other ethnic groups who fought in the Civil War. But as we know, history is made by people, and you have some amazing stories of individuals, people who put on personas that they pretend to be like an officer from Hungary, I believe, right? And it's completely invented, and these stories are extraordinary, and they're both woven into the text, but then there are also these separate parts where you give a deep dive. One of the great things about this book is that it's beautifully illustrated. New York University Press did a fabulous job. So before we dive in a little bit more into that, let's set the stage. Let's tell our audience something about American Jews in the 1860s. Where were they living? It's a fairly select group of cities, as you write. What was their place in American society, and how many were there?
So in 1860, we think there are probably around 150,000 Jews in America, most of whom are newcomers, people who've immigrated in largest numbers from Central Europe, from what will become later Germany. There's no Germany at the moment. There are a proliferation of states and principalities and kingdoms. So many of them are from Central Europe, some from Eastern Europe, and some from the Caribbean and elsewhere. So quite a diverse Jewish population at the time. But most of whom have arrived very recently, have arrived in the 1840s, have arrived in the 1850s. So really newcomers establishing themselves, for the most part, in America. And most of them are economic migrants that come as young men and young women to America. And they are chasing opportunity, in search of stability and an ability to create lives for themselves in ways that they cannot dream of doing in much of Europe at this time. And yes, they do flock to larger centers. There's a substantial Jewish population. The largest Jewish population in America at the time is in New York City, and likewise a substantial Jewish population in Philadelphia and Cincinnati. But again, one of the features which sets Jews apart from other immigrant populations at the time, and Jews are arriving at the same moment that others are coming to America in vast numbers, certainly from Ireland, but also from Central Europe as well and from elsewhere. But what sets Jews apart somewhat is that they do flock to cities, but they also disperse across the countryside. We see Jewish peddlers trying to again make a living for themselves on the rural byways of America, again peddling between farms in the countryside. We see shopkeepers in small towns really across the country as well. And this dispersion will have implications for Jews during the war for reasons we can discuss as well. So these are mostly newcomers. They are mostly establishing themselves, mostly are in commercial occupations again, which is somewhat different from most other immigrant groups, that these are sort of shopkeepers or those who are drawn to commerce. But the recency of the arrival, the newness, is another feature of this population as well. And the American Jewish population has grown dramatically during this period. A relatively small Jewish population, the 1820s, 1830s, even 1840s, is much, much larger by 1860, and is really only at this point beginning to try to establish institutions, national institutions. Yes, there are synagogues in many small towns and larger cities, but again, it's this moment of transformation of American Jewish life, even before the war.
Right. So just let me remind everyone who's watching and also our audience here, we will be taking questions, so think of your questions and get them ready for when we get to that part of the program. So I think probably the right place to start then as we dive into the war is, so there's this massive political crisis in the United States with the election of Lincoln. And do you have a sense of how the Jews responded to that?
Absolutely. So Jews respond in some ways like their neighbors, but in other ways differently from their neighbors. As people who've come looking for economic opportunity, they are, as many other Americans at the time, are deeply unsettled by the prospect of America coming apart at the seams. These are people who've crossed the Atlantic, have taken this great risk in doing so, this bet on America's future, and the prospect of uncertainty or political instability, the possibility, again, familiar to Jews, particularly from Central Europe, knowing that political instability, revolution, these moments of crisis produce problems for Jews. This is familiar to them. These are people who've lived through the revolutions, the failed revolutions in Central Europe of 1848. So again, they perhaps have a particular worry about, what will this mean for Jews, for themselves as Jews. So certainly, this is on their minds. Likewise, in terms of their politics, is interesting as well. These are people who, for the most part, are living in cities, those who live in cities, who live in New York, for example, live in cities where the dominant politics is the politics of the Democratic Party, a party which is in opposition to Lincoln. And the Democratic Party has a very substantial immigrant support base, including Jews. And again, there's and many Jews come to share the politics of the Democratic Party. Again, we see some Jews who are drawn to Lincoln very early, are drawn to the message of the Republican Party, who are ideologically committed to the Republican Party, but again, they seem to be relatively exceptional within the Jewish population at the time. And Jews, again, have particular positions on some of the major political issues of the time as well. Obviously, the single greatest cause of the Civil War is slavery, is the question of whether what role should slavery have in the future of the United States. And Jews, again, have a very particular experience of this. Because the abolitionists and the abolitionist movement, which is very active, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s, derives much of its energy and leadership from evangelical Christians. from those who see this as a religious and political cause combined. A number of those key leaders within the abolitionist movement are involved at the same time in efforts to convert Jews to Christianity. And this is deeply troubling to Jews, this sense that the abolitionist movement is perhaps contains within it some form of threat or fear for Jews. So we see, again, a wariness when it comes to Jews relating to abolitionism. But again, the picture is more complicated. We see certainly some Jews, particularly those who are active in the failed revolutions of 1848, these ideological immigrants who arrive, they are, some of them at least, are drawn to abolitionists as well. But for the most part, there's tremendous diffidence and uncertainty about the war. What will this mean for not just for Jews as Jews, but also Jews as citizens of America more broadly?
I also think of how Jews have families on both sides of the divide, and so how they, during the war, have to craft the letters that get through, how they have to, kind of not talk about politics if they want to preserve the family unity. So Lincoln issues a call to arms, April 1861, and how did the Jews respond? And here, kind of zoom out, compare Jewish responses to those of other Americans.
So there's certainly, the start of the war in April of 1861 has this electrifying effect on the North, on the Union, that we see many of those who prior to this point in time harbor uncertainty about the prospect of America coming apart, the prospect of war. Their views transformed by the firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And we see exactly the same effect on the Jewish population too, that the single largest number of Jews who enlist in the army enlist in April of 1861. So that same, flocking to the flag, that same desire to fight for the preservation of the Union. But it's very much that focus, the desire to save the Union. And this is, again, most Jews, I think, hold this in common with other immigrants in northern cities, for example, with the Irish and Germans, etc. This sense that this is a war for union and not necessarily a war against slavery. Again, Jewish soldiers will change their mind in some cases during the war itself, but certainly that sense of rallying around the flag and patriotism in 1861 in particular. But there is one important difference which quickly becomes apparent, and here we can look at some of our slides as well. I think it's the third slide I would like to show you over here. So one of the features which becomes dominant very, very quickly when it comes to Jews in particular is the emergence early in the war, really in the summer of 1861. The war's only been going for a handful of months. The emergence of anti-Semitism in American society. This again sets Jews apart from other immigrant groups, that yes, there is some anti-Irish and anti-German sentiment, but much of that is delayed until later, that certainly there's instead quite positive sentiment towards Irish and German recruits early in the war. When it comes to Jews, there are two motifs, two themes which emerge very, very quickly. One of those motifs, let's actually go to the next slide. We'll talk about these men in a second. And you'll see, in the next slide, a cartoon. Here we go. A cartoon which really reflects what I'm describing. The sense that this argument which is made in the press in a very, very public way, that Jews prefer profits to patriotism. That they are shirking, and they aren't signing up in sufficient numbers because they prefer to profit off the war effort. This is purely a canard. There's no basis in reality to this, but this certainly affects how Jews come to feel and think about the war relatively early on, that they're receiving this hostile treatment on the home front. This is going to affect whether you decide to enlist. So there's this motif, and then in the next slide, a second and related motif, anti-Semitic motif, which emerges early in the war as well, again in 1861. And this is the idea that Jews are involved in particular in crooking the army in terms of supplying substandard goods, that they're involved in what comes to be described as shoddy contracting. Shoddy is actually a technical term which describes wool which has been recycled, wool fiber which has been recycled and is typically used as insulation for clothing. It's not something you'd want to weave a uniform for soldiers to wear, but again, because of the urgency and demand that the army produces as it grows rapidly in size in 1861, a number of unscrupulous contractors see opportunity in producing uniforms which are made out of shoddy, made out of this fabric which should not be used for outfitting the troops. And there are these scandalous reports in the press in 1861 which describe soldiers who are in the field and there's a rainstorm and their jackets and pants collapse, disappear in the rain, and they're left all but naked in the field. Again, whether this is exaggerated or not, probably somewhat exaggerated, but certainly this idea that there are these shoddy contractors taking advantage of the government and also taking advantage of the sacrifice of soldiers in the field, this idea takes hold, and the press begins to use the term Jew and contractor interchangeably during 1861. And again, this will have an effect on Jews who otherwise might eagerly enlist for the army, begin to say, wait a second, why should we enlist when there's this drumbeat of prejudice on the home front, which is questioning our motives, questioning our patriotism. This, by the way, as an aside, is where we get the term shoddy from. We know it as a term referring to substandard goods, but it really emerges in this way in 1861 as applied to, it leaps from it being a technical term into a term more broadly used. And this sets Jews apart from other immigrant groups, from particularly the Irish and Germans and Scandinavians, who are going to encounter prejudice during the war, but later in the war. Typically in 1863, there's for a variety of reasons, there's a wave of prejudice directed at the German community and at the Irish community, but Jews experience this earlier, and it affects, again, decisions to enlist early on in the war.
What's so striking about your discovering this, especially in the moment we're all living in today in the United States, is this notion that, like you said, Jew and contractor are synonymous. And, we've heard recently all sorts of canards about Jew and something being, controlling particular industries. So we're seeing that theme emerging, more than 150 years ago. It's really shocking, really incredibly shocking. So we know that Germans and Scandinavians formed their own units, and we know that there have been various statements made that there were Jewish units, but you're able to debunk that. Can you tell us?
Absolutely. So let's go to the first slide and then the second slide as well. The first slide in particular is a very striking slide and has been in some ways misinterpreted. The first slide is of a flag from a regiment which is raised in Syracuse, New York, in August and September, October of 1862. So the timing here is significant. This is after a really disastrous summer for the Union Army, that it suffered enormous casualties at Antietam and elsewhere. And there is a drive to raise new regiments to replenish the enormous losses on the battlefield. And the flag is a regimental flag from the 149th New York Infantry, a regiment which is, again, it's a voluntary unit. That these are people, there's no conscription at this point in time, but there is a threat of conscription. There is, again, the prospect that if there aren't sufficient voluntary enlistees, that conscription or some form of coercion might be imposed. And the flag is donated by the Jewish, as it describes, the Jewish ladies of Syracuse to the 149th Infantry Regiment. And that's been understood by historians since then as reflecting the claim is then the 149th Infantry is clearly, therefore, a Jewish regiment, or perhaps has a Jewish company in it. A regiment is really the base unit of the Union Army, typically 1,000, sometimes 1,200 men. A company would have 100 men. And so the claim is that this is either, sometimes some historians claim a Jewish regiment, sometimes that it has a Jewish company in it. And look at the flag, that's clear demonstration. Here's the flag behind me over here. Likewise, there's a regiment in Illinois, the 82nd Illinois Infantry, which also has Jewish sponsorship. That there are, again, the Jewish community raises money for that regiment. And as with the 149th Infantry in New York, we see the Jewish community rallying around this regiment. That, for example, in Syracuse, the local rabbi holds recruiting meetings in the synagogue. And there are all sorts of other figures who come to the synagogue to really preach in favor of enlistment, trying to encourage people to join this volunteer regiment. But in reality, even in the 149th Infantry, only about 20 Jews are in this entire regiment. Yes, Jews do sponsor the regiment, and this is typical of a whole variety of religious and other organizations sponsor regiments or sponsor companies. So all sorts of organizations are doing this, and the Jewish community is doing it in Chicago with the 82nd Illinois. They're doing it in New York as well, but only 20 out of roughly 1,000 men within the regiment are Jews. Certainly there's one company which does, as I said, has most of those Jews serve within it, but the reality is that there are no regiments and no companies in the entire Union Army where Jews make up a majority of the soldiers. And this, again, to get to your point, is different from other ethnic and immigrant groups. That Jews, the dominant experience is serving in relative isolation. We know, again, from the Chappelle roster that Jews serve in at least 293 regiments in the Union Army, but in only 25, actually slightly less than 25 regiments, do we have more than 10 Jews serving. Instead, half of all Jews serve in a regiment where they are in four other Jews in that regiment. So the dominant experience is isolation, is being alone or with maybe one or two other Jews in your proximity. Whereas for other immigrant groups, again, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, more typically serve in regiments where the dominant ethos is either German or Irish or Scandinavian, so genuine ethnic regiments, or even when they aren't in ethnic regiments, have a cohort of others who share their same background with them. And this has particular implications for Jews in particular, because if you are relatively isolated, it means that it's much more difficult to live as a Jew within the army, that you have fewer potential friends and comrades in arms who are Jewish too. And also it means that encountering adversity, it means that you often do this alone or with very few others to assist you. And this again sets Jews apart from other groups. And this, again, why is this the case? Why is this pattern different for Jews than other groups? There are a number of factors at work here. One is that dispersion, which I described earlier, the fact that Jews in 1860 live in small towns across America, which means that regiments are raised locally. They're raised in towns and cities across the country. And in many of these towns and cities, there are a handful of Jews. So those who join up are going to, again, perforce be a minority, a small minority within their regiments. That's one factor. And another very important factor here, too, is that when it comes to particularly the German and Irish community, there are local political leaders within the immigrant community who become ethnic champions for their regiments, who see opportunity in raising regiments, in supporting regiments. They see it as a very important way of staking a claim for immigrants in American society, so therefore creating German and Irish regiments. And we don't see the same phenomenon within the Jewish community for a variety of reasons, partly because of the anti-Semitism that we spoke about earlier, that a number of Jewish leaders are very worried about what the war means for the Jewish community, and likewise are very diffident about sending or encouraging Jewish men to enlist in an army where they are going to be isolated, where they might encounter anti-Semitism, where they are going to be serving in relatively isolated ways. And likewise also just a number of key Jewish communal leaders in 1860 are generally just very weary of the war as well. So we don't see that encouragement of the kind that we see with other ethnic groups in America.
So what's so striking is because of that isolation and the anti-Semitism, that you found that the Union soldiers adopt some tactics that we know American Jews will use later on in the 20th century to not be marked out as Jews. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And the next slide is again, a very unusual and revealing example of this. So a number of Jewish men who do enlist will adopt aliases or will sometimes to conceal their identities as Jews, sometimes for other reasons as well. In fact, one more slide. This is, in fact, I will talk about this later, but a regiment where the colonel is Jewish and there's no hiding of his Jewishness. Then the next slide is an example of someone who goes to great pains, great efforts to conceal his identity. It's a figure that you mentioned earlier, really a larger-than-life character. These in fact are two brothers here in the image on your left. These are the Eustasi brothers. They are originally from Hungary. The soldier on your right is Frederick, and then the one on your left is his brother Karl. Frederick raises this regiment. This is a poster behind me here. It's on your right of a regimental recruiting poster which is plastered all over New York. It's a regiment which directly appeals to immigrants, where the promise is that it will create companies reflecting a really polyglot collection of different immigrant groups. So there'll be as it says, Italians, Hungarians, Germans, French patriots, you should sign up for this regiment. And it'll be led by this dashing Colonel DeArmas, who claims to have been a great hero, a military hero from Hungary, claims to be an aristocrat, claims to be a master swordsman, be a master horseman, to be a dancing master, someone who has a command of multiple languages, etc. So again, a lot of the appeal of this regiment is connected with its colonel. And it's a regiment which, as you can see from his uniform, a rather elaborate, over-the-top uniform, which is designed by Frederick DeArmas, and with all sorts of gold thread, etc. It's quite over the top. And again, appealing to the ego, you might say, of potential enlistees, that this is going to be a dashing regiment to join. And the regiment does, in fact, go marching off to war, but rumors soon begin to circulate that Frederick DeArmas might not be who he seems to be. And one of these rumors, which no one takes seriously at the time, is the scandalous claim that he's not actually a aristocrat, that he's not a dancing master and master swordsman and etc. That instead he's a Jewish horse dealer from Pressburg. But this rumor is too ridiculous for anyone to take seriously, because you can believe some of the other rumors about him, that he's a martinet, that he's impossible to get on with, that he feuds with his officers, etc., etc., etc. But the fact that he might be a Jew, that's surely unbelievable. But it turns out we discovered, again through our research, and others have identified this before as well, that these larger-than-life rumors are indeed true. That Frederick Eustasi was David Strasser, probably a horse dealer from Hungary, who had reinvented himself, had established this elaborate and wonderful identity for himself once he came to America. So his is a larger-than-life and example. He's a fabulist. He has invented this whole character for himself, which turns out not to be true. In fact, his military career is disastrous too. Turns out not to be a particularly successful colonel as well. He lands up quite soon after in Sing Sing prison, again, reputation destroyed. He tries to recover his reputation after the war. His inventions continue too. He later reinvents himself as a general, etc. But more common amongst Jewish soldiers, again amongst the minority of Jewish soldiers, but certainly a pronounced phenomenon, is taking of aliases, is taking of identities to conceal their sometimes their Jewish background, or sometimes their immigrant background too, and this is quite widespread amongst Jewish soldiers. Sometimes they take German names, sometimes they take wonderfully American names, sort of fantasy names, which I'd imagine as soon as they open their mouths, these immigrants who are German speaking, it'd be clear that they're not, George Smith, that they really are, from Bavaria or Hesse or somewhere else. But again, it does give us a sense of their concern before they enlist about what they might experience. This concern that perhaps it's better not to openly pronounce our Jewishness as soldiers. There's that explanation. The other one is that these are immigrants who have had to reinvent themselves already in America, that there is wonderful opportunity as immigrants to create a new life for yourself and not to be tied necessarily to your European past. And I think it also, it in part emerges out of that as well, that the wonderful creativity and opportunity and anonymity of creating a life for yourself in America, and then creating an identity for yourself in the army as well.
I love the story about the horse dealer. I just think it's amazing, and it is one of the things that your work with the Chappelle Foundation made possible, to discover this and a real character. But then your larger point is that Jews were essentially changing their names, and of course we know in the 20th century from our colleague Kirsten Vermeeklish's work that this is something that American Jews do when they need to mask their identity, whether it's because, in your example, because they're isolated, because they're afraid of anti-Semitism, or because of the anti-Semitism of the 20th century. It's a really startling intervention into the historiography to trace it all the way back. So, we're talking about a colonel. So I want to ask you about, as you know, one of my favorite characters in your book and in his letters is Colonel Marcus Spiegel, and I think it would be really interesting to hear a little bit about how you have amplified what we knew about him from the letters that he wrote.
Absolutely. So Marcus Spiegelgan is an immigrant, someone who's making a life for himself in America in the 1850s. He marries a Quaker, Carolyn. And in the late 1850s, they are trying to establish themselves in a relatively small town, then on the railway line in Ohio, in Millersburg. And he's someone who initially is very uncertain about enlistment. Again, he lives in an area, county, which is deeply, deeply democratic. And we know, in fact, he comes to share the politics of his neighbors as well, because he corresponds with them and the local press during the war. But he decides to enlist ultimately for very prosaic reasons, that the war is devastating to his business. He has the misfortune of having bought property, to have invested heavily in property, in establishing a warehouse. Just before the war, he's hoping to trade seemingly in wool and other things which are raised locally in the area, but his timing is bad. He ultimately is, in a way, obliged to enlist, or he comes to see enlistment as his path out of this crisis, of this personal crisis, of in this devastating potential of the war, that he's going to go bankrupt, because the war promises a number of things. It promises, firstly, in Ohio, what are described as the stay laws, that if you enlist, bankruptcy proceedings cannot proceed against you. So this protects him and his investment against ruin, financial ruin. The other attraction for him, as it is with many other soldiers at the time, is the promise of a steady paycheck. That both the bonus which the military pays when soldiers enlist and the promise of steady wages is attractive to him. And initially he seeks what is described as, it's described as a bomb-proof job. He wants to potentially become the quartermaster within the regiment, which is raised in part in the town which he lives, because again he's a patriot, and yes he sees he wants to preserve the Union, but he has these more prosaic reasons why he enlists. But then what's striking, which comes clear from his letters, which he writes to his wife, and there's a wonderful collection of letters which go back, which we have his letters to her. We don't, unfortunately, have her letters back to him, but you can really hear her voice in a way in his responses. What we see is this transformation, that this immigrant who initially wants a bomb-proof job comes to relish military life and comes to actually discover that he has quite a lot of skill in commanding men in the field. He doesn't, in fact, become the quartermaster. Instead, he becomes an officer, and then he rises through the ranks within his regiment. And we see the tone of his letters changing. Initially, he's assuring his Quaker wife that I'm going to leave the army as soon as I've secured our financial position. As soon as we've saved enough money, I'll get out. And then those promises begin to become less and less frequent. And instead, you can hear her, in a way, her responses to him in how he's writing to her. And he says, yes, he wants to continue to make money, to earn these wages, but he has a duty to his men, and he has a duty to the cause as well. And we hear more and more of that, as in a way their argument proceeds over months and then years, that she's urging him clearly to come back home, and he resists, and increasingly the call of duty is very, very important to him. And again, his regiment, he turns out, as I described, to be a very fine officer. His regiment, though, does encounter tremendous adversity. This is a regiment which is part of the effort to capture Vicksburg, and spends months in appalling conditions in the mud of the Mississippi River, of the banks of the Mississippi River, where his men are dropping like flies through disease and the terrible conditions that they're encountering. And again, he's very hostile initially to Lincoln and the Republican Party, and there's a fair amount of the sort of racism we see commonly amongst Democrats at the time as well, that they really, again, he responds very negatively to the Emancipation Proclamation, for example. But then again, there's a transformation that as he spends more time campaigning in Mississippi, again, as Grant in particular becomes more and more successful, we see the shifting of views, this sense that, yes, we need to destroy slavery. We need to punish the South in particular for dragging us into war by destroying slavery as well. So again, these interesting shifts within this individual. Unfortunately, his story is a tragic one, ultimately, that he, relatively late in the war, is on a transport vessel which is ambushed, and he's killed in the bombardment. His brother, who is with him, survives, but spends then a lengthy period as a prisoner. And it has been their dream, the two brothers, that they will establish themselves in business after the war. They'll return to Ohio and will make their fortune. And the brother does, in fact, do this, exactly this, that Joseph Spiegel goes back to Ohio, ultimately establishes the Spiegel Catalog Company, so becomes tremendously successful. But his brother, the officer, Marcus, is now remembered for these letters, these wonderful letters which he shares with his wife.
And I should remind everyone that his wife converted to Judaism. We actually have her conversion certificate. I think it's the oldest conversion certificate that we have in the United States. And after he's killed in battle, and he leaves her with 4 children, if I remember the number correctly, she gets a soldier's pension. She gets a pension from the government. This is the first time that the federal government pays pensions to widows. But that's not enough to make ends meet, and so she ends up running a kosher boarding house. So it's an amazing story, and you're absolutely right. You can see her anguish in his answers. You can actually almost hear the questions that she's asking. So how did the Jews remember the war?
So it's a great question. How do Jews remember the war? Very differently in North and South. We see in the Confederacy, or in the states which had been part of the Confederacy after the war, where Jews develop their own version of the lost cause, their own celebration of particularly those who have fallen in battle, so a martyrology, grand monuments at cemeteries in Richmond and elsewhere, so a distinct pattern in the South. But the North is more complicated. Instead, we see something very striking, which I, again, spent much time looking at the Jewish press and all sorts of other sources. And I'd expect that this transformative war, this war where you have significant numbers of Jews who have fought and have come back now as veterans after the war, that these veterans would occupy significant positions within the Jewish community, that their war service would be a matter of pride and a matter of celebration, that the war would be spoken about in a variety of ways. And instead, the general pattern is exactly the opposite, that for at least 2 decades after the war, we see not complete silence, but certainly in much of the North, I think a discomfort with the war and a real desire to move on and not to talk about the past. And I think it connects with my theories, it connects with things we've spoken about already, which is the fact that the war generates this extremely aggressive, uncomfortable form, I think new form of anti-Semitism in American society. And it's not something which Jews, again, want to think about, that they want to, again, focus on the future. So there are these wartime episodes which others have written about very, very well. For example, General Grant's General Orders Number 11, other moments in the war which are deeply troubling for Jews. So really a desire to focus on the future. And it's only again then much, much later, primarily in the 1890s, that Jews in the North will come to remember the war anew. And if in fact we go to my last slide, you'll see exactly this. It's strikingly in the 1890s that a Jewish veterans organization is created, the Hebrew Union Veterans Association is created, and a culture of remembering and celebrating the war emerges. And again, I think what that's about is that the 1890s are a moment of vast Jewish immigration to America from Eastern Europe. Likewise, a moment where anti-Semitism becomes again a very considerable problem in American society. So here we see, this is Isidore Isaacs, who's very active both in the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the general, a general veterans organization, which is very powerful and important in American society. So this is him wearing the uniform of the Grand Army of the Republic. But also he's a formative figure in the creation of a Jewish Civil War Veterans Association as well. And you can see examples here of the medals which the members of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association will receive and wear proudly as well. But this is a phenomenon, as I've described, of really the 1890s and afterwards, in response, as I'm suggesting, to this wave of anti-Semitism in the 1890s, claiming that these new immigrants from Eastern Europe who are flocking to America's shores, that these newcomers can never become proper citizens, that there's something inimical between being a Jew and being a citizen. And what better way to prove Jewish patriotism, to prove that Jews can be good citizens, than by pointing to the Civil War, pointing to Jewish veterans, pointing to a record of war service, which actually hasn't been spoken about for the 2 decades preceding that point in time.
So I have more questions, but we have a whole stack, and they're really good. So I'm gonna turn to some of them. So the first one is, do we have some combat stories showing firsthand how Jews experienced the war?
Absolutely. There are, again, wonderful accounts for those who are interested of precisely this, that both, again, letters and diaries which describe the experience of being a soldier in the field. And I can give you an example from, again, Marcus Spiegel, who we spoke about earlier, that he's writing to his wife about his experience and about, again, what a deep impression that it makes on him, that he describes his first battle, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, and how he remembers, in fact, he writes to her a year later describing the battle to him, how he describes it as being stuck in his memory, how he has a powerful both visual and oral memory of the experience. So what he describes is how, again, on the day of the battle, he is eating his soup, and there's a sudden call to arms, and he writes to her a year later. Again, it might be a very Jewish response to the experience, but he writes to her about having to discard his soup. I think he initially runs with his container of soup, but then has to ditch it, has to throw it aside, and then this, again, the deep impression of forming lines, forming into his regiment, companies coming together, and the experience of a charge, and with artillery being fired at them, and again, interesting references to manhood as well. That this again, one of the motivations for soldiers is to prove your manhood, to establish your manhood, again, reflecting the broader culture at the moment in time, and describing how others are quaking at the incoming fuselage, shells and bullets being fired at them, and again, the sound he describes of someone directly behind him who's shot, and again, it sticks in his memory, but this description of exhilaration, of then charging at the enemy. So certainly we do have these accounts. And I'll give you one other example of precisely this, that the man who graces the cover of the book, Edward Solomon, again a fascinating figure, someone who's exactly the opposite of the Diostasi brothers who I described earlier. This is someone who begins with a very humble start or relatively humble start in the army, begins as a junior officer. Again, he proves himself in battle, and then has an almost, you could say, Zelig-like experience, or Forrest Gump-like experience in the army, where at a number of key moments he comes ultimately to effectively command his regiment, and is very able in command. And again, I was reading accounts of key battles, both in the campaign for Atlanta. So he's under General Sherman, his regiment's under General Sherman, and then in the March to the Sea and the campaign in the Carolinas. So these are key campaigns during the war, that he and his regiment appear at critical moments in the battle, in some cases to turn the tide. And there's this, again, those who've written accounts of these battles aren't noting this commonality, but he has this seemingly preternatural ability he and his regiment, to be there at the critical moment. So in a number of battles, they charge at exactly the right moment to save the Union line, or to turn the tide. So again, there are plenty of examples of this. And likewise, again, when it comes to everyday experience of battle, then Jews are, for the most part, like everyone else, that some are heroic in the ways I've described, and many others are ordinary soldiers without particularly distinguished military careers.
So we were talking before about Jews and writing letters because the families are divided. So we have one specific question, which is: Are there stories about Jewish families who have sons fighting on both sides? And I should tell everyone that Adam is also writing. His next book is going to be on the Jews in the Civil War, but in the South. So I'm sure you've got lots of ideas about this.
Absolutely. So Absolutely so. That we have very good numbers about exactly how many Jewish families are divided in this way. It's both brothers on either side, many examples of cousins, brother-in-laws, etc., in either army. And again, this is particularly troubling for Jews. This is an unusual example for Jews at this point in time, at least, of this experience. That we certainly will see it particularly in the First World War again, this phenomenon. And this is, as I said, troubling, this idea that Jews will be potentially firing at each other. And there's both a reality to it. We have examples of, again, and I'm working hard to verify these examples at the moment, but claims that one brother is involved in the capture of the other brother, examples of that kind. But also there's a quite elaborate, let's say, mythical literature around this too, that stories of Jewish soldiers who supposedly deliberately fire into the air so that because they want to avoid potentially shooting family members on the other side, or Jewish soldiers who recite the Shema before entering into battle, again in part because of the fear that they might be encountering a family or loved ones. This again explains in part why Jewish leaders at the time, a number of the key figures within the Jewish community, it's a community where the community's key preeminent figures are an Orthodox rabbi in Philadelphia, Isaac Leeser, and a Reform rabbi in Cincinnati, Isaac Mayer Wise. One of the reasons why, again, they harbor such different feelings about the war comes to exactly this, that they are so worried that the war is dividing American Jewry and also dividing families as well.
So you mentioned the Shema, one of the topics that we didn't talk about before, and it is one of the questions that we have here. What about Jewish religious observance?
Absolutely. So I can show you a slide here which speaks to exactly this. It's a cartoon which a very unusual cartoon of sent to an illustrated newspaper by an anonymous, as the cartoon says, a Hebrew volunteer. And it's a cartoon where the editors of the newspaper printed without any comment. It's a cartoon of a collection of pigs, with the implied message behind it, or the clear message behind it, is that this is one of the sacrifices that Jewish soldiers will have to make, is existing within an army which with a diet is very, very heavy on pork, where soldiers are eating pork in every single possible variety on a daily basis. That their diet consists of a hardtack. It consists, here we go, behind me, it consists of salt pork, of bacon, of beef, but pork is a feature you cannot, very difficult to avoid within your diet. So this is a cartoon which in effect is commenting on exactly this. So it's quartermaster's supplies sketched by a Hebrew volunteer. So the statement obviously being, this is one of the sacrifices you will have to make, one of the challenges you will encounter as a Jewish soldier is your diet. And again, Jewish soldiers are foraging like everyone else. They're trying to supplement their diet, but in essence, it's almost impossible to exist in the army without being obliged to eat pork. But again, Marcus Spiegelgan, who I described earlier, one of his wonderful exchanges with his wife is about food. Soldiers then and now are obsessed with food. Their diet is largely unvarying. They're bored with what they're eating. They're perpetually hungry. So he and others are sending letters home, imploring their families to send them food, trunks of food from home and other goods from home to make their lives that much more bearable. And there's a lovely, again, exchange. He's writing to Carolyn, urging her to send both alcohol to again make his life more bearable, but also Gerichten, food, Jewish foods from home, which he's clearly lusting after. There's lovely then, he's much anticipation of the arrival of a trunk with all these foodstuffs which he's lusting after. He then describes to her how wonderful it is to eat pickled duck tongue on the march. And again, news to me that pickled duck tongue is I didn't know was a Jewish delicacy, or I presume a German delicacy, but presumably something deeply appealing to him. So soldiers are doing this when it comes, Jewish soldiers and others are doing this when it comes to food, but also we have letters of Jewish soldiers who are writing to rabbis, writing to Jewish newspapers, requesting prayer books, requesting other Jewish ritual objects so that they can try and worship as Jews within the army, requesting matzah from home as well. There's again a wonderful account of a Pesach Seder, Passover Seder in the wilds of West Virginia, again trying to cling to a Jewish identity in the army, which is very, very difficult to do, again because of that isolation I spoke about earlier, the fact that these Jewish soldiers are, at best, have a handful of other Jewish soldiers around them. And again, it's an army which makes relatively few allowances for religion more broadly. Yes, supposedly on Sunday there is allowance for the Christian Sabbath, and some, but not all regiments will have a chaplain. So yes, there are allowances, particularly for Christian soldiers. For Jewish soldiers, it's that isolation is very difficult, particularly with a religion which is so much centered on the home and on family and on practice. Being in an army where you're going to be isolated, but at the best of times have very, very few other Jews around you, it means that it's very, very difficult to be a Jew.
So one of the questions we have, and something that we haven't talked about yet, is we know that during the Civil War, this is the moment when Jews are allowed to become military chaplains. And you found some remarkable information that has revised how we understand that story. So do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. So, in fact, I can show a slide related to exactly this. This is the second slide. This is a regiment raised by Colonel Max Friedman. It's raised in Pennsylvania. Max, here we go. This is the recruiting poster for the regiment. This is an image, a photograph of the encampment of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry. The Cameron Dragoons, named after the Secretary of War at the time, who's from Pennsylvania as well. Max Friedman does what is common for those raising regiments in the early stages of the war in particular, which is to recruit heavily amongst officers, certainly amongst friends, family, and those acquaintances. So it means that amongst the officers there are a number of Jews, including, again, this is typical of the time, there's a fair amount of cronyism, nepotism, including their family members who are officers within the regiment too. He's involved, as I described, in the pre-war militia in Pennsylvania. He's not the only Jew who's an officer in the pre-war militia who raises a regiment. There's another regiment which is raised by another Jew as well in Pennsylvania at the time. And this regiment, though, is unusual in that it selects as its chaplain a man by the name of Michael Allen, who has some religious background. He's not a rabbi, but he's clearly a religious man and familiar with Jewish law as well. And we have what's extraordinary about Michael Allen. Again, he serves for a relatively short period of time for reasons I'll describe in a second. But we have his diary, which describes what he's up to. This is really in around September of 1861. And chaplaincy is relatively ill-defined at this point in time. So he's giving sermons, ecumenical sermons on a regular basis to the regiment. We have copies of some of his sermons, and they aren't Jewish sermons. They really are, because the soldiers in this regiment are mostly Christians, and he's speaking to a broad audience. And also, we know that this regiment initially is near D.C., Washington, so we know that he spends a fair amount of time in Washington. For example, he wants on the high holidays, he wants to be in Washington to worship with other Jews. But his military career ultimately is cut short. He resigns, and there's again a debate about why exactly he resigns after really it's a little more than a month in the service as chaplain. But the interesting story then emerges afterwards that very quickly a rabbi in New York who's soon to lose he knows that his contract is coming to an end there. He doesn't have rabbinic ordination, but he's someone who's serving effectively as chazan within a congregation. He's clearly gets wind that that this position is available, and he then applies for the position. But his timing is bad, because no sooner does he apply for this position than the ordinance which regulates the chaplaincy, which says that a chaplain needs to be of a Christian denomination, is enforced to exclude him from this role. So in essence, he applies for the position and he cannot fill it because he's not a Christian. He's not a Christian minister. He's clearly Jewish and has a Jewish religious training. And this becomes then a cause célèbre. This is picked up by the crusading editor of a New York newspaper, Horace Greeley, and becomes then something which is reported on broadly in the newspaper. Historians, since this episode, have thought that this was a test case. They've thought that this is Max Friedman, Jewish colonel commanding a regiment, has purposefully selected this individual to apply for the chaplaincy in order to create a test case, which will then force the government to change the law, force Congress to change the law. What again, additional digging has established that one of I spent a lot of time doing this work for the book. What becomes clear is that actually Max Friedman doesn't know about this application for the chaplaincy, and for other quite complicated reasons, he doesn't want attention to be drawn to his regiment, and he quickly goes to a newspaper in Washington, D.C. at the time to say, wait a second, our regiment has nothing to do with this man. We have not sought out the appointment of this individual as a chaplain, and there aren't more than 20 Jews in our entire corps, never mind in our regiment. Again, the story does not end well for Max Friedman to either of the parties. That the man who's applied for the Arnold Fisher who's applied for this position as chaplain, he does not become chaplain. He ultimately will leave America and go back to Holland, where he's from. But he's remembered for failing to become chaplain of this regiment. And Max Friedman, the reason probably that he doesn't want attention to be drawn to his regiment is that he's doing what a lot of other colonels are doing at the time, which is padding his regimental rolls, that there are lots of phantom soldiers in his regiment, that they're probably collecting rations and wages for soldiers who aren't really there. He doesn't want all this attention drawn to his regiment because it's potentially going to be very embarrassing. And his career also will end in disgrace for exactly this reason, that he very soon after will also leave the regiment, because there's scandal attached to what he's been up to. Again, as I said, this is fairly common practice at the time, unfortunately. But again, so what I argue is that the chaplaincy issue has been somewhat misremembered, that it's seen by historians as a test case of Jews trying to change the law and using Arnold Fisher in this way, and it turns out it's probably more of an accidental story. The law ultimately is changed, both because of the intervention of the Jewish community, that there is lobbying and effort to change the law, and Lincoln ultimately intervenes, but not quite in the heroic way that the story has previously been told.
It's such a powerful story about how, well, we were talking about anti-Semitism in the Civil War, and we've been talking about these individual soldiers, but this is a moment when anti-Semitism rises, but it's also a moment, for whatever reason, Jews win another right in the United States, and it's kind of stunning. So we only have like a few minutes left, so I'm going to take the last question. What can you tell us about the next book, about the Confederacy?
Absolutely. Now, I'll just speak to your last point very, very quickly before I answer your question. I think that one of the legacies of the war, as we've suggested, is the emergence of a new type of anti-Semitism in American society, which will have long-term consequences for American Jews. And I think the other one is something that you've gestured towards now too, that because of this adverse experience during the war, because of anti-Semitism, and because of the variety of pressures on Jews during the war, what we see emerging, I argue, after the war is a new form of American identity as American Jews. That prior to the war, we have a a diverse community, of a disparate community, where you have immigrants from a variety of different places who often think of themselves as Bavarians or think of themselves as Hessians or etc. But there isn't necessarily a distinct form of American Jewish identity which emerges. And I think one of the things that the war does, and in the cauldron of war, it does create the sense of a need for a common American Jewish identity. And again, partly driven by the adversity of the war, and also I think by the sense that again there's strength in solidarity as well. And look how we've won rights for ourselves during the war by banding together. So I think that's again something which very important which comes from the war. Again, your question about the Confederacy is something I've been thinking a tremendous amount about. So how does the Jewish experience in the Confederacy differ in a variety of ways? Again, perhaps surprisingly, there are many fewer Jews living in the Confederacy in 1861. There are probably 25,000 Jews living in the states which will comprise the Confederacy, 125,000 Jews living in the Union. But again, the roster is still working on the Confederacy at the moment, so the Chappelle Foundation is still very much at work on trying to find more Jewish Confederates. But in terms of total numbers, there probably will be almost equivalent, perhaps more Jews who enlist in the Confederate Army than in the Union Army. And again, it's for a variety of reasons. It's not necessarily because the Jews are all committed to the Confederacy. I think it's in part because it becomes very difficult not to serve in the Confederate Army, that the conscription becomes increasingly restrictive as the war goes on. There are tremendous pressures on Jews and others in the Confederacy as well. So certainly in terms of one of the striking features is numbers. Another striking feature, again, in fact, relates to a topic we've just spoken about, which is anti-Semitism. That yes, there is anti-Semitism in the Confederacy, and it takes somewhat different forms from that in the Union. There are particular features which we see in the Confederacy which are different. But again, one of the striking differences is that in the Union Army, we see key generals. We see Grant and Sherman and Butler, who are all very significant figures who openly espouse deeply anti-Semitic views. They use language which is shocking then, shocking even more so now. And again, there are all sorts of reasons why this is the case. They're partly echoing what we spoke about much earlier, the broader mood within American society. And this plays out in General Orders, General Grant's General Orders Number 11, etc. But in the Confederate Army, we see a different example. We see, in fact, Robert E. Lee again bending over backwards at various points in time to accommodate Jews. Again, the key rabbi in Richmond writes to Lee on a number of occasions requesting that Confederate soldiers be allowed to leave their positions around Richmond to worship in the high holiday services, and he very politely, it's sort of really, I suppose it's an example of diplomatic charm that he refuses, but in the most winning way. But another even more telling example is that there's an appeal from the same rabbi to Lee, requesting that a Jewish soldier who's an immigrant who has deserted his post in battle, and he's been sentenced to be executed as a deserter, that he should be forgiven for this act because he's an immigrant, because he doesn't speak good English, etc., etc. And again, this clemency is granted by Lee. And again, it's maybe Lee is exceptional in this way. I'm not in any way trying to celebrate Lee as a figure. He's a deeply problematic figure for all sorts of reasons. But again, I think that there's a different message for all sorts of reasons coming from the Confederate Army when it comes to Jews, at least from senior officers within the Army. Yes, there's a strongly, very, very powerfully Christian ethos within the Army, but we don't have those same examples of an equivalent of Grant making anti-Semitic remarks about Jews. So I think these two ways, but also all sorts of others, this experience for Jews is entirely different within the Confederacy.
So you have to promise to come back to the Haberman Institute when the next book is done. And would everyone please join me in thanking Professor Adam Mendelsohn.